The last image I hold of her before the war is her quiet smile through tears, standing on the platform of Munich station as the train pulled away, setting me on a journey into the unknown. It was 1950, and though Europe was rebuilding from wartime ruins, the air still carried the scent of dust, hope, and fear. I stood there in a crisp uniform, deported from my Bavarian American roots, clutching the ticket that carried me to the Korean War. I kissed Anna goodbye that day. She promised she would wait, and I promised I would return. Little did we know, time would scatter our faces across continents, and that I would not see her smile again until 40 years later. Anna was a nurse volunteering at a provisional clinic in post-war Munich. I was an immigrant, navigating a home that felt foreign, even though I spoke the language. She offered me warmth in a city still cold from loss. I remember her wrapping a hand-knit blue scarf around her neck, the wool comforting her more than any coat could. She said quietly, "Don't make this smile my last." Or, there in the crowd, with steam rising from chimneys and survivors searching for new rhythms, we clasped hands. I kissed her softly, not knowing it would be our last touch for decades. That train faded into memory. At first I saw her silhouette, then the scarf, then only an echo in my soul. I was being sent to Korea as part of the American Volunteer Corps under the UN flag. I didn't want to go, not really, but duty outweighed desire, at least in the minds of officials who saw me as more American than Bavarian. As the train left, I didn't turn around. The fear that I wouldn't return if I looked back held me in place. And so, I crossed oceans, settled into uncertainty, and left her image alive in my mind, even as the world moved on. If this story touches you the way it moved me while writing it, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. Anna and I met in the quiet wreckage of post-war Munich, where every brick seemed to whisper stories of things lost and almost forgotten, and where people, though surrounded by rubble, tried to build something resembling a future. I was 26, recently returned from the States, born and raised in Ohio, but Bavarian by blood. My parents had emigrated in the 1930s, chasing work and stability, only to find themselves longing for home again after the war had turned both their native and adopted lands inside out. When they decided to go back to Germany, I followed, part curiosity, part obligation, and part something I couldn't name. I didn't expect to find someone like Anna in a place so bruised by history. She was volunteering as a nurse at a makeshift hospital built into a half-collapsed school near Sendling-Tor. Her brother had died in Stalingrad, and her father had never returned from the Eastern Front. She didn't talk about them often, but when she did, her voice carried a kind of worn grace, the kind that only people who've survived grief without letting it destroy them can carry. We met on a Monday. I was delivering crates of medical supplies through a post-war relief effort funded by American donations, and she offered me a chipped mug of coffee and a smile that didn't match the grey walls or the grey sky outside. That smile, it was like sunlight breaking through dust. Over the weeks, we fell into something that was never officially called love, but lived in the details. In shared cigarettes behind the hospital, in long walks through the English garden, in quiet pauses where we just existed side by side, saying nothing, yet speaking more than words aloud. I remember the first time I made her laugh, truly laugh, and how she caught herself halfway through as if joy were something dangerous in a world still figuring out how to be whole again. By the spring of 1950, our connection had deepened into something that felt permanent, or at least worth building a life around. I had begun to imagine staying, maybe even asking her to come with me back to the States once things stabilized. But fate, or history, or whatever unseen hand moves people like pawns through time, had other plans. I received a letter from the US. Consulate in Frankfurt. Because of my American citizenship, I had been drafted into the US Army as part of the support deployment to Korea. The UN was mobilizing forces, and though I wasn't a combat soldier by training, I was fit, available, and, most importantly to them, bound by passport and duty. I didn't tell Anna right away. I held the letter in my coat pocket for 3 days, walking beside her through blooming courtyards and war-torn alleys, pretending our world wasn't about to fracture again. When I finally told her, we were sitting in a little cafe near Viktualian Markt, the kind of place where the chairs wobble and the soup is always too salty. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She just looked at me and said quietly, "Don't make my last smile happen today." I kissed her at the station. The train was already whistling, the conductor pacing impatiently along the platform. I held her close, breathed in the scent of her hair, lavender and something faintly medical, and promised her, in a voice that shook, "I'll come back." She nodded. She didn't say anything. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe, like me, she feared that words were too fragile for promises like that. Then the doors closed and the train moved. And as the landscape pulled her away from me, shrinking her frame into the distance, I felt something inside me break, like a bone set wrong that would never heal quite the same. I didn't look back. I told myself it was easier that way, that if I looked at her one more time, I'd never find the strength to leave. The army training was fast, brutal, and impersonal. Within weeks, I was shipped out to Busan, South Korea. The war was nothing like what I had heard growing up. No banners, no parades, no glorious music in the background. Just mud, confusion, frostbite, and the constant thud of mortars pounding the edges of your thoughts, even in your sleep. At first, I wrote letters, long, detailed letters, describing what I saw, how I missed her, how I couldn't wait to see her again. But I never got a reply. Maybe the mail never made it. Maybe she'd moved. Maybe she thought I'd forgotten her. Or maybe, and this haunted me, maybe she chose to let go. So I stopped writing, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. The silence became a weight too heavy to carry into the foxholes and the frozen ridges. I needed all my strength just to survive. Still, every night before sleep, I would see her face, that last smile, the blue scarf she wore, the way her breath curled in the cold air as the train pulled away. I never forgot it, even when everything else began to fade. The war in Korea was a kind of silence I had never known before. Not the absence of sound, but the hollow, deafening kind that lives between explosions in the frozen trenches and inside the minds of men who forget what day it is, because the sun doesn't rise with hope anymore. It just signals more waiting, more surviving, more of the same. By the time we arrived in Incheon, I had already stopped expecting to understand what was happening around me. Orders came fast, often unclear, shouted over gunfire or passed in scribbled notes. We dug in wherever we landed, sometimes for a few days, sometimes for hours. The terrain was alien, jagged hills, dry valleys that turned to sludge in the rain, villages abandoned so completely it felt like ghosts were the only ones left behind. Every night, when I wasn't on watch, I would pull her scarf, the one Anna gave me, out from my rucksack. I'd kept it, stuffed deep between spare socks and a small Bible. I would unfold it, hold it to my face, close my eyes and try to breathe her in. Pretend that I wasn't halfway across the world. Pretend I hadn't traded everything soft in my life for mud and fire. I wrote to her, at first with careful detail, about the men in my unit, about the food, the terrain, the awful cold. I told her how I couldn't sleep without picturing the way her eyes looked that day at the station, how her voice echoed in my mind more clearly than the bullets whizzing past my helmet. I wrote to her like she was my anchor, my reason, my final destination. But the letters never came back. I waited for weeks, then months. Nothing. I asked the mail clerks, begged them to check. They always shrugged. Sometimes things get lost, they'd say. Sometimes people move on. And that broke me in ways I didn't know I could break. I kept writing, but the letters got shorter. I stopped describing my days. I stopped asking how she was. Eventually, I stopped writing at all. We were hit hard in late November. It was bitter cold, the kind that sinks into your bones and makes you question why you're still breathing. During an ambush near the Han River, I took a piece of shrapnel in the left arm. It spun me to the ground, where I lay staring at the grey sky and thinking not about death, but about her. Whether she was walking through snow back in Germany, whether she still tied her scarf the same way. I was pulled out by medics, barely conscious, and when I woke up, I was in a tent that smelled like smoke and rot. My arm was bandaged, my mouth tasted like rust. There was no news from home, no name to call out, no face to hold on to. Then came the worst part, captivity. I spent 7 months in a North Korean prison camp. Time ceased to exist there. There were no calendars, no clocks, only hunger, cold, and the endless shuffle of men who looked more like bones than soldiers. We slept in shifts, ate whatever they threw at us, and tried not to think about tomorrow, because tomorrow was a luxury. But every single night, even when my ribs ached and my head spun from fever, I thought about her, Anna. Her name was the only thing I whispered that still made me feel human. I would repeat it over and over in my mind, like a prayer I didn't expect to be answered. Not to God, to her, as if somehow she could hear me and remember. When I was finally freed, a silent, sunken version of the man who once kissed a girl on a train platform, I wasn't ready to go back to Germany. I wasn't ready to find out if she'd waited. I wasn't strong enough to face the possibility that she hadn't, so I went back to Ohio. I moved into a small apartment near the steel plant where my uncle worked. Got a job stacking crates. Told people I'd been working logistics overseas. No one asked for more. No one wanted to know what Korea had done to a man who came back without scars on his face, but couldn't sleep through the night. I didn't date. I tried once or twice, but it wasn't fair. Every woman was a mirror I held up, trying to find traces of Anna in their laugh, in the way they said goodbye. It never worked. So I stopped. I filled my life with silence, read newspapers, cooked the same meals, walked the same streets. Every October 4th, the day I left Munich, I'd take out the scarf, still wrapped in wax paper, still holding the faintest trace of her. I'd sit by the window, close my eyes, and let myself believe that somewhere, somehow, she was doing the same. I never forgot her, not for a day. But I buried that chapter so deep inside me that even I started to wonder if I'd imagined it. If maybe she was just something the war invented in my mind, a soft memory to shield me from the sharp edges of everything else. Until one day, I realized that time hadn't erased her. It had just hidden her, waiting for me to find the courage to look again. In 1990, my knees had begun to betray me on staircases, and my breath ran out quicker than it used to. But it wasn't age that pushed me back to Germany. It was silence. A silence that had grown louder over the years, pressing against my chest, reminding me of something unfinished. I had spent 4 decades waking up every morning, pretending I didn't need to know what happened to her. One day I couldn't pretend anymore. I booked a flight to Munich on a whim, without telling anyone. My passport, still crisp from disuse, carried the name of a man who had once stood on a train platform and sworn he'd return. And now, 40 years later, I was coming back. Not as a soldier, not as a tourist, but as a question. I arrived in early October. Autumn in Munich was as beautiful as I remembered. The gold leaves, tumbling through Marienplatz, the distant sound of violinists outside the subway stations, the sharp, earthy smell of roasted chestnuts wafting through the air, but nothing felt the same. The city had healed. New buildings had risen. The skyline no longer looked like a memory. Still, some places hadn't changed. I made my way to Munich Central Station, Hauptbahnhof, the place where I had last seen her. It had been modernized, dressed in glass and LED screens, but the bones of the place were the same. I stood in the exact spot where she had kissed me goodbye. People hurried past me, suitcases clicking against the tile floor. No one knew that the man in the brown coat wasn't just looking at the platform. He was looking into the past. I don't know how long I stood there before a young woman asked if I was lost. I smiled and shook my head. "No," I told her, "I'm exactly where I need to be." For the next few days, I walked the city. I carried a small photo of Anna, the only one I had, taken on a park bench in 1949, and asked around. Libraries, churches, retirement centers, local hospitals. I visited every archive I could, digging through staff records, checking old registries, chasing a name I had whispered into the Korean cold. Most people politely shook their heads. Some looked at me with sympathy. A few offered to help. I began to think it had all been a fool's errand, the romantic delusion of an old man who had clung too tightly to a wartime ghost. Then, at a community center near Dachau, a volunteer recognized the name. "Anna Vogel?" she asked. "I think she still volunteers here, actually." My heart stopped. Or maybe it started again. Dachau. I hadn't been back there since 1950. The name alone carried weight. Not just for its history, but because it was her hometown. I remembered how she used to talk about the chestnut trees in the square, how she missed them in the spring. I spent 3 days rehearsing what I would say. I stayed in a modest hotel, ate little, slept less. I read through the letters I had never sent, wondering which one best told the story of my heart. None of them did. What do you say to someone who once carried your soul in her hands? On the 4th morning, I walked to the care center. The building was cheerful, filled with sunlight and laughter, and the gentle hum of radio music playing from a nearby office. I asked the receptionist about Anna. She paused, then smiled. "She's reading to one of the residents right now, room 12. The hallway seemed impossibly long. Each step felt heavier than the last. My palms were sweating. My throat was dry. I stopped outside the door and peered in. There she was. Older, yes. Her hair had turned silver, pulled into a soft bun. She wore glasses now, and her posture had softened, but her voice was exactly the same. She was reading from a large print book to a man in a wheelchair. Her words were calm, melodic, full of the same warmth I had carried with me for 40 years. I waited for her to finish the page. Then I stepped into the room. "Anna?" I said softly. She turned. It took her a moment. Her eyes squinted, adjusted. Her hand moved instinctively to the scarf around her neck, the same pattern, the same blue, and then she smiled. That smile, my God, that smile. "You took your time," she said, her voice trembling. "I wasn't sure I was still welcome," I replied. She stood slowly and walked toward me. She didn't rush, she didn't cry. She just reached for my hand and held it. And in that touch, that one quiet, trembling touch, I felt everything return. The boy I had been, the man I had become, the war, the silence, the weight. "I knew," she said. "I didn't know when, but I knew." We sat together for hours. We filled the air between us with stories and memories and questions we had both learned to live without answering. She had never married. She'd never stopped wondering. She had kept the letters I sent, the ones that did arrive, in a box beneath her bed. And now, somehow, we had both lived long enough to look each other in the eyes and say, "I'm here." When I saw her smile again, it didn't feel like time had passed. It felt like time had folded in on itself, like it had been holding its breath for 40 years, just so we could find our way back to this exact moment. Her smile wasn't youthful, but it wasn't faded either. It was richer, fuller, like a melody played slowly, with more meaning in every note. I had waited half my life for that smile, and it hadn't forgotten me. She led me to a bench in the courtyard behind the care center, a quiet place surrounded by birch trees and soft wind chimes, and we sat without speaking at first. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was sacred. After a few minutes she turned and said, "I thought you were dead." I nodded, unable to look her in the eyes just yet. So did I. We started slowly. I told her about the war, not everything, but enough. The cold, the silence, the camp, the way I stopped writing because I couldn't carry the weight of unanswered words anymore. I told her about Ohio, how I went back and tried to live, but never managed to really do it. How I tried to find her in other faces, but always ended up more alone. She listened the way she used to listen, fully, quietly, with her entire body. She didn't interrupt, didn't correct my memory, didn't question the gaps. She just took it all in. Then she told me her side. She had stayed in Munich for a few years, then moved to Dachau to care for her aging aunt. She never married. She dated once or twice, but always found herself comparing. She said, "No one ever looked at me the way you did. Like I wasn't just someone surviving. Like I was still alive." She volunteered at hospitals, then later at the care center. Said it gave her peace, looking after people who still had stories to tell, even if some had forgotten their names. She said she didn't expect to see me again, but never stopped hoping. "I kept your letters," she said, pulling a small envelope from her purse. "I used to read them on Sundays. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry. I just reached for her hand, and she let me take it. Her skin was thinner, her fingers colder than I remembered, but the way she held on hadn't changed. From that day on, I visited her every morning. We didn't try to make up for lost time. You can't. 40 years is too much to rewrite, but what we did was more beautiful than rewriting the past. We began a quiet continuation of a story that had never really ended. We'd sit in the same spot, drink tea from paper cups, talk about things big and small, music, memories, regret, hope. She told me she dreamed of seeing the ocean again, something she hadn't done since before the war. So one weekend, we took a train to the North Sea. She stood barefoot in the cold water, her dress fluttering in the wind, and laughed. I had never heard her laugh like that, not even in 1950. I took a picture, one I keep in my wallet to this day. That moment, that laughter, that look in her eyes, it was everything I'd ever waited for. The staff at the care center came to know me. They smiled when I walked in. One of the younger nurses whispered once, "You give her light." I wanted to say, "She kept mine alive." Anna had a way of making small things feel eternal. A piece of music playing in the background, the way she folded napkins, the way she still paused before crossing a street, even if no cars were coming. Watching her live again, truly live, gave me permission to breathe in ways I hadn't since the day I left. One afternoon, I asked her, "Do you ever regret waiting?" She looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "I didn't wait, I lived, but I always left space for you." That answer undid me. For years, I had seen myself as a ghost of a man, someone who'd left too much behind, someone who'd never found his way back. And yet, here was this woman, not clinging to the past, not angry, not broken, but whole. And she had left room for me. In her heart, in her life, in her time. We never spoke of what might have been. We never said, "What if?" Instead, we said, "Thank you," more often. We held hands. We watched the seasons change. We laughed at bad movies and shared stories from books we loved when we were young. And every Sunday she'd read me one of my old letters, out loud, her voice steady, her eyes glowing, as if to remind us both that even when we were lost, we were never truly gone. She kept that smile for me, tucked away through wars and winters and the wear of time. And I carried the memory of it through jungles and steel cities and lonely American nights. And when we saw each other again, that smile did not ask questions or seek explanations. It just welcomed me home. Because love, real love, doesn't fade. It waits. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it smiles again. These days, Anna and I go back to the train station every week. We don't say much when we're there. We just sit on the same bench where she once waved goodbye and I once promised to return. We watch people rush past with their phones and their coffee and their bags full of things they think matter. But for us, nothing matters more than still being here, side by side. After all this time, we're not young anymore. Our steps are slower. Our hands shake more than they used to. Sometimes she forgets what day it is, and I forget where I put my glasses. But none of that bothers us. We've already lived enough days apart to know how precious it is just to live one more together. People often ask us how we found each other again after all those years. We tell them the truth. We never really lost each other. We were just walking on separate roads, carrying the same memory, guided by the same promise. And when the time was right, not perfect, just right, those roads crossed again. We never married. We never needed to. What we have doesn't need a piece of paper. Our commitment was written in a moment on a platform in 1950, sealed with a kiss, carried through war and silence and age. No vows, just faith. And yes, we missed a lot. We lost time, we lost chances, but we didn't lose each other, not really. Not where it counted. She told me once, "The thing about time is, it doesn't erase love, it just tests it." She was right. I used to think I had waited too long, that the war had stolen more than years. It had stolen my one chance at a life with her. But the truth is, life gave us what it could, and what we have now, these walks, these talks, these soft Sunday mornings filled with music and memory, they're enough. More than enough. Sometimes we hold hands and say nothing for hours. Sometimes we cry over things we've already forgiven. Sometimes we just sit in the quiet and let the past settle gently between us, not as something painful, but as something earned. Because when you've loved someone for most of your life, even in silence, even across oceans, the reunion is not about fixing the past. It's about honoring the weight. And I know now, with more certainty than I've ever had, that some promises don't break, some hearts don't forget, and some smiles, they were always meant for you. So if you ever find yourself wondering whether to hold on, whether to wait, whether love can survive war, distance, or time, I hope you remember this. I kissed her at the station, and 40 years later she smiled at me again. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine while writing it, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep sharing true stories that inspire, move, and remind us what really matters. We post new stories every day, real people, real love, real hope.